Think about a time or a moment in your career when you realized that leadership wasn't necessarily about a position, because that's what we're really seeing in this everyday leader stuff is there's this untapped position or this untapped potential that doesn't have the position or necessarily the title, right? And so I want to talk about that. So a moment in your career when you realized it wasn't necessarily about the position or title, it was really about who you were and how people experienced you. What
Mm.
shifted for you when you realized that?
In grad school, I remember there was this taxonomy by these researchers called French and Raven. And it's one of the papers I remember the most vividly because it talks about these five different types of power. And there's, positional power, there's information as power, there's likability as power, there's the power to reward, there's the power to punish. There are all these different power bases, as they called them. And I remember having a moment being
Yep.
like, oh, wait a second. Power isn't positional. It was in grad school. I was like, power isn't positional. Power could be information. Power could be you're followed and respected. It could be that you can coerce and punish. Like people have the power to do that even if they're not in a position. People can hold back information from you. I remember that vividly because it changed the way I thought about power, which oftentimes people think about for leadership, that people who are leaders have power.
Right. Right.
And Matthew McCarthy, former
Yeah.
CEO of Ben& and Jerry's, who you and I just did a session with, often talks about the CEO being the most dangerous person in the room. And I love when he says that because he says the CEO is the most
Yeah,
dangerous
I
person in
love
the room
that.
because they have the most power and the least information. And
Yes.
I think what I realized early on is if I have information, which I remember being like a junior person, sitting with the president or CEO of a company that I was working with as a person who was working in the company. So at Bloomberg, sitting with Dan Doctoroff, and I had a piece of data that he didn't have. And all of a sudden I was like, I
Hmm.
have
Hmm.
power. And it's not about having power over someone,
Yeah.
which position sometimes sort of alludes to
Yeah.
that, like, oh, you have power over someone. This is actually, I have power to have
Right.
impact. And so now I have a piece of data that can have
Yeah.
impact.
Yeah. Yeah. And you feel empowered to use it.
I feel impact, exactly. And
That's
then the
amazing.
conditions are created for me to actually say that. So Dan Doctoroff would create the space to say, you're sitting at the table. What do you know that we're not talking about? And so I watched someone in a
Yeah.
position of power create the space for those who were empowered to actually speak. And so that's why my earliest experience of realizing, oh, when I have data or information or an experience to share, that's powerful. And that doesn't mean I have to have a title or a certain salary band to exert that
Right.
power.